we'll give it just a couple minutes.
Okay. Will we be able to take questions and stuff at the end, or?
I'll sit right here and I'll look, and if
Okay.
somebody asks something, if I get it fast enough.
Yeah. Well, what I was thinking, I'm gonna have to get close to it to show my pictures
Right.
and stuff. So maybe at the end, you come in and do.
Yep, that's fine.
questions.
I'm gonna stand back. So we got 1, 2. So it's working.
All right.
We'll give it just about.
Somebody there.
Guys, we're going to give it just a couple minutes, and then we'll get started. We'll let some people come on board.
Yeah.
We're definitely out in the rain,
Yeah.
but we're covered. We got a fire for David to have to speak over. At least it calmed down a little bit. Man, that thing was loud. I was like, this is a nightmare.
One of us is a Marine, one of us is an idiot, so we're not afraid.
I'm an idiot. Hush. Or maybe the one is both in combined.
Yeah, you can multitask, man.
Them Marines known for eating crowns and shit, right? We got 6. I'm gonna say go ahead. There's 7.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
gonna say go ahead and get started. Everybody
right.
knows it's there.
I'm just gonna,
I'll start.
yeah.
Hello, everybody. We are over our technical difficulties. It is possible that this meeting shut off because we lose service. We are in the nasty rain, but we're covered. Built David a fire so he's not freezing too bad. David's been with the club for a very long time. Well, I hope he covers the start date and end date. And the reason that he was part of the club is because he was the fisheries biologist working with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. Ever since I started attending meetings, David was always there, and that's not really something that's required of him. He did that on his own because he cared about what he's doing, and that says a whole lot about who he is and the relationship that he had, not just with his job, but with the people that he was supporting that go out and fish for muskies. So, without any further me rambling on, I'm going to go ahead and let David have at it.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to try to compete with the wind and rain and fire here with my old voice. So let's see how it goes. I apologize to the people that tuned in last week and only saw Don's feet, but I couldn't get the thing to work. I had an operating system issue, and it was what it was. But I'm going to try to walk us through some stuff, and if my technical stuff works tonight, we'll see how it goes. I think I'm a mirror image, yeah, so you're not going to be able to read stuff, but I'll show it to you anyway, because I'll post a lot of this later on the club site. But I'm not really being facetious, but I'm going to start with this. That's me in 1960, which that's up at Craggy Gardens. I was born and raised in Asheville, grew up within walking distance of the French Broad. The reason I show that picture is not really to be cute, but to provide a waypoint in time, because it was about that time that the last known record that the Wildlife Commission ever caught a wild muskie in North Carolina waters was right around that same time. So it's been within my lifetime that we had native muskie in these waters and documented it, but only just. So that gives you an idea of the time scale. I don't have any pictures of the muskies that were collected then, but Chris Kane found this picture in an old wildlife magazine. That's a muskie that was caught in the 20 Mile Creek arm of Cheoah Reservoir in 1950. And that's, I've seen muskie pictures from the French Broad, but none after about the 1940s, and I don't own any of those pictures, so I couldn't bring them. But The thing that is pretty much common with all the old pictures of muskie is that they're dead. That they're hanging from a leader or lanyard or something, and or just nailed to the wall or something. But there was, harvest back in those days was harvest, and that was one of the pressures that was on the muskie at that time. But for the French Broad, here's an old picture of a mill down at Marshall. You can see the effluent just going straight in the river there. That was another big thing. I remember when we were kids, we used to dare each other to put our hands in the French Broad. We used to tell each other to pull out a skeleton from all the acid that was in there. But I don't think it was that bad, but it was too bad to support a sport fishery. And the river kind of died a death of 1,000 cuts, though, because there was also, here's a picture from the 20s. There was pretty heavy agriculture up in the headwaters throughout all those years, and even earlier than that, back in the 1800s, they actually dredged the river to maintain a steamboat service, which lasted about 4 years, and ultimately, ran into the realities of that river channel and ran aground and never moved again, I don't think. I've heard that that the bell is up in a Baptist church up in Horseshoe. I don't know. I've never seen it, and that the steam engines were repurposed for sawmills. But that's how that came about. Now this slide is text, so it's not going to show up. But I was just going to give you a timetable of Wildlife Commission management of muskie before I came along. And the muskie stocking began around 1970 and involved a lot of waters in western North Carolina. Some were stocked multiple years, some were just stocked once or twice, but just about every system in the western part of the state, from Asheville west, was stocked at some point somewhere in that river system. But it was over a decade later when we really started looking at what might be going on with the fishery. And J. Davies in 1981 reported that natural reproduction might be occurring, but they weren't sure. And what they wanted to do was go to an every other year stocking so that they could identify fish from years. If they found fish that they could determine were from a year that they didn't stock, then that would tell them that they had natural reproduction. The problem was that most of the aging back then was done by scales, and it's hard to get an exact read on which year you're dealing with, so you might have an error of a year either way. So it was what we had at the time, but it didn't really give us a conclusive answer on that. In 1985, the Monahan report, which was up to that time the most definitive work that had been done on the river, he did a rough quantification of habitat in all the musky waters that were being managed at that time, and that led to some adjusted stocking rates, and made a recommendation to try fin clipping as a method of tracking the fish. And at that point, Don probably remembers some of the work that was done starting around that time. But in 1990, Jim Barawa wrote that they confirmed some natural reproduction, but didn't have enough data to tell whether it was really making a contribution to the sport fishery, and needed to find a long-lasting marking technique because the fin clips just weren't reliable over time. I think they confirmed the natural reproduction using light traps for fry and some other methods. But that was pretty much what we had up to that time. I came to the mountains in 1994. That's me with Chad Thomas, who is now the supervisor down on the coast. That's 94, 95. We're up on Kerr Scott Reservoir with black bass sampling. And when I came up here, I had a variety of responsibilities, including a lot of warm water fisheries, including black bass and some other prominent fisheries. Walleye was one of a lot of people were interested in. That's walleye from over in Hiwassee Reservoir. And then had a few striped bass fisheries. That's also from Hiwassee, one of the monsters from over there that I was also responsible for overseeing research for. And then I show this one, this crappie, just because, and I'm from the south, so I say crappie. But that was a big part of my time early on, because a lot of those pollution impacts that were bad for the rivers produced a lot of nutrients for the reservoirs. So when some of the regulations started cleaning up the rivers back in the late 60s and early 70s, the reservoirs started to clean up too. And then an unforeseen side effect of that was that some of the fisheries declined, and one of those in the mountain reservoirs was crappie. So I spent a pretty good amount of time and effort talking to angry crappie fishermen the first few years I was up here, because guys that remembered catching crappie all over a reservoir were finding them more concentrated in the upper end and some of the creeks, and they could tell it was declining, and I couldn't really do much about it except listen to them and try to explain the process that was going on, but it wasn't something we could really change. So anyway, I didn't come here to talk about crappie, but that was a big thing back then. I actually had to talk to some legislators and stuff about it. It was a big thing. These are shad in one of our surface set gill nets. Back in the late 90s, we looked pretty hard at shad populations in the reservoirs, trying to figure out how to manage them through stocking and everything. And that was a big effort back in the late 90s for me. But it was about that time, and this is the me I used to be there. It's about 1999. It was about really, as soon as I got up here in the mid-90s, the district guys told me that one thing I needed to do was to talk to a man named Don Funderud about Musky. So I got in touch with him and set up a meeting time, and at that time the club was meeting over at what was Shoney's over on US 70 in Otine, and I remember going in there not really knowing what to expect. Met Funderud for the first time, so that's a moment in history. Also met Bill Clark and Gramer Yarborough, and those two guys were they were both leaders of men, and they would talk to you in a way that made you think you needed to do what they were saying to do. And what they told me I needed to do was make sure that there was still going to be a sport fishery in the French Broad River for muskie. And I left that meeting that night having promised those guys that until we could demonstrate that they were reproducing naturally in the river, that I personally would not withdraw hatchery support from the river. And that, to the extent that they knew what to think of me, that seemed to satisfy them. So that was the beginning. It was a winter night about like this one back in 94 or 95, somewhere in there. But in the early days with the Muskie Club, there were two things that we did that I spent most of my time with the Muskie Club doing. One of them was stocking the French Broad River. Here's an old picture of young Don Funderud back there in the stern, and that's Bill Clark in the middle, and Lee Cannon from Table Rock Hatchery loading up some fingerlings. That's at Blantyre. Unfortunately, picture's backwards, but it's right there at the bottom of the old slide at Blantyre. And that was a big thing we do annually. I'd get with the guys, and we just like we do now. Although we didn't have all the technology, so we had to make plans way in advance. But we'd meet them at the ramps and with the truck and load them up, and they'd go out and spread the fish. The other thing we did that was a big thing back then that isn't now, and I wish I had some pictures. I'm sure there's some in the club files. Was we did the trade shows, especially up at the Civic Center with John Patterson. We had a booth there every year for the RV and boat show, and I would go up there as the resident expert who would answer questions about muskie. And most of the people we talked to up there didn't even know there were muskie in North Carolina, so we felt like we were at least getting an awareness out there. And occasionally we'd recruit somebody for the club, but had a lot of fun days up there with the guys doing that and setting up the booth, and we did that for a lot of years. And then as the RV boat show kind of changed, we moved out to the fairgrounds for a while and did a couple out there. We tried the gun and knife show one year, and that really wasn't our crowd, but we gave it a good try, and we ultimately as internet resources came along, we had other ways of doing outreach that were less labor intensive and more effective. So we haven't been doing that for the last few years, but that was a big thing back in the day. I want to back up a little bit. I had a couple of memorabilia to show you. Start with this one. This was before my time, but some of you may have seen and you can't read it, of course, but it's the Muskie Club patch. I found one of these in the basement. I thought I'd lost them all, but that was part of a project before my time we were doing a kind of an angler diary, much like what we're doing now, where guys were recording their hours and everything. But as a reward for participating in that program and submitting the report, each guy would get one of these patches. And I'm sure there's a few of them still floating around somewhere. But as far as I know, it's the last one I got in my house. But they were useful as an incentive to get people to stay with the diaries and keep sending in data. And then later, when I was working with anglers that would sometimes, what I ran into a lot was people would catch a muskie, and it'd be a barred muskie, and they'd think they had a tiger muskie, and it'd been years since we stocked tigers, but they'd think they had one, and they'd think it was the state record because their muskie was bigger than the state record tiger. And I'd have to go out there and tell them, no, it wasn't what it was. It was just a plain muskie, and it wasn't a state record. So what I started doing was saying, well, that's not a state record, but it's a nice fish, so here's a Muskie Club patch. So a few guys got them by catching big muskies that they thought were tigers for a while. But ultimately, I finally talked Raleigh into putting an asterisk on those state records in the Regulations Digest with a little note that these don't exist in the state anymore, so don't think you've got one. And that saved a few people some disappointment, I hope. Anyway, I'll come back to the memorabilia later. A couple of other things that we were doing in the 90s was we geared up a river electrofishing program. I think it was probably 95. I went out with Mickey Clemens, who was the district biologist at the time. And we spent a day putting in on the river, anywhere we could get on the river, which wasn't many places then. There was, the old ramp at Westfelt was there, but it was over in that little creek at that time. And then there was the slide up at Blantyre that we couldn't get a shock boat in. And then there was that that big sandy area up there near where Bill Liddy used to live. And then the only other place we had was the concrete ramp at Wilson Road Bridge. So we managed to get the district shock boat in there, which was a 16-foot John boat with a 35 horse and a 500-watt generator and a holding tank in it. So that was about the only place we could muscle that thing in. But we spent several hours shocking up and down that reach. And that was the first time that I ever saw a live muskie. We got one in the boat and measured it and took some scales and let it go. But that was my indoctrination into muskie on the French Broad. So the next year I ordered a jet boat and got that put together. And then we did some scaling down of all the equipment in the other boat to make it a little bit lighter. And we started a program of systematically electrofishing the river from about Westfelt up to the Horseshoe Bend. Typically, is depending on the year. We usually went until we did that whole reach, or until so many of the boats were busted that we couldn't work anymore. And so it was usually the latter, because it was rough going in there. Here's a picture from about 98 or 99. That's the jet boat with the black Evan root on it. That's me driving, and we've got a chase boat over here. What we'd do is we'd work two boats, one up each side working the structure, and then the chase boat in the middle. And when we'd roll one out, the chase boat would come in and try to catch it. They had a big net we couldn't really maneuver the big nets in the bow of the shock boat, so they would come in and try to net the fish, and we'd just try to get our nets around the head or the tail to try to keep it from tumbling down river or sinking out of sight until they got up there. But we used that method for about 5 years. And the thing that made that the most useful is at the same time we got hold of a micro tagger. And a lot of you that have been to the hatchery have seen these, but it's a machine that puts a little piece of metal about the size of an iron filing in the muscle on the cheek of the fingerling. And about 98 to 99% of the time that stays in there for the life of the fish. And that allowed us, we could move that from left to right, in different years. And at that time we were still just stocking every other year. So if we could pick up a tag reading in a fish, we had a 4-year window, where we wouldn't have error. And that allowed us to do a pretty good job of tracking when these fish were stocked. And especially we could say without a shadow of a doubt that the fish was a stocked fish. And that gave us a much more reliable means of telling whether the fish were from the river or from the hatchery. And here's a picture of me holding the muskie, and that's Paul Pittman taking the tag read, and Ed Grooms and Catherine Willard in the bow watching while we're doing that. But we did that from 97 to 2002, I think, and basically that was when we really got to take home that nothing was supporting the French Broad muskie fishery except Table Rock Hatchery. see. I'm gonna switch gears for a minute and go look at my stuff over here. All right, that takes me out of the 90s and into the 2000s, and that was really the turn of the century. Was kind of a sea change in a lot of ways, because we made a lot of things happen about that time. I'm going to show you a headline you can't read. This is from October of 2000. Future public access to Lake Adger uncertain, and that came down the pike around that time. The lake was getting developed. The homeowners association was set up, and people were building houses down there. And the developer at that time was building the marina at the old Red Barn site. And access to the lake was becoming so chancy that if you couldn't, in addition to all the the usual issues with water level and stuff, you didn't know if you were driving to the lake if you were going to get runoff or if they were going to let you go in the lake. And it was kind of a bad situation. And the Wildlife Commission didn't know what the outcome was going to be, so. From about then until I think maybe 2004, we did not stock any muskies in Lake Adger because we weren't sure if it was going to be public waters. But about that same time, the state record muskie was caught out of Lake Adger, because when you could get on the lake, there were some really nice fish in there. I don't have a picture of the state record, but I've got a nice picture. There's Wayne on the ramp with that big one. But there were some really nice fish coming out of there. And there was a lot of interest from the club and other people to maintain access to that, because technically the lake and the river were public waters, but there was no land ownership around there. The club and some of the landowners that were sympathetic to public access, and the Wildlife Commission and the county and others were looking at trying to find a way to get public access to Lake Adger, and ultimately that culminated in the agreement that I think still exists today between the Homeowners Association and the developer at that time and the Wildlife Commission that allows public access at the marina ramp. And to date, it's not the best location on the lake for a ramp, clearly, but it's the place where we've got one, and that agreement is held up. So that's what we have. So about having resolved that, we resumed stocking and also started electrofishing in the lake. There's Amanda with a fish from about 2007, I'd say, but that's an Adger fish. Lost my place on my thing. The other thing we did, or tried to do, was I tried to go down there with my tagger wand on club fish days and follow the boats around and try to get some tag reeds off of fish that the club caught. Unfortunately, my presence was a curse on club fish days, and I think we did that 3 times, and not only did I not see any fish, but nobody saw any fish. But they were good opportunities for fellowship. And this one here is back in the back of Jackson with the North Carolina Muskie Club and the Tennessee Muskie Club in a joint fish day that we had a while back before we got run off of that point. But yeah, I had some nice days, but never could collect any fish data from that. I'll show another big fish. Here's Derek with one of his monsters. And the segue into the Catawba. It was about that same time in early 2000s that interest became elevated on the Catawba fisheries above Roadhiss and James. And club members and other folks were spending a lot of time down there, having a lot of success catching big fish. And those fish seem to be self-sustaining, or there's an outside chance that some of them were coming from the hatcheries just by washdown or whatever. But it seemed like that there was enough backwater swamp habitat on both of those stretches of river where the muskie were able to reproduce and grow to a pretty big size. So that leads to the next thing that was a big thing in the 2000s, and that was looking at improving the regulations. Let me get my notes on that. I had to go back and reconstruct the timeline. I was going to do this for Tim anyway for the club records, but in the state record was called an Adger on the 23rd of January 2001, 41 pounds 8 ounces, and a lot of other big fish were being caught around, and this was about the time that we were getting a lot of new membership in the club. Derek and Brian Argotti and Josh and Clint and Wayne are all. I remember them first from those years, and those guys were spending a lot of hours on the river and on Adger and other waters, and really drove the interest in coming up with more protective regulations for muskie. So the first thing we proposed was to take the French Broad River from US 64 at Etowah up to the headwaters and make it catch and release only for muskie. And we enacted that effective 1st of July of 2005. Prior to that, all waters in North Carolina were two fish, 30 inches, I think, at that time. And Don probably remembers when it was even, I think, maybe 26 inches, but that was before my time. But the 30-inch regulation and two fish creel limit was regarded by a lot of muskie fishermen as way too liberal for the nature of the fishery. So we went ahead and put that out there, and it went to public hearing, and didn't hear any response to the contrary. So it went into effect on the 1st of July of 2005. As we got into 2006, I guess people were, that had not heard about it before, who fished the river, began to hear about it, and we got a lot of pushback on it because they weren't allowing any harvest, and there was some interest from other anglers. And well, if you catch the fish of a lifetime, some people wanted to take a fish and mount it. I know that's a controversial thing among muskie fishermen, but that there's people on both sides of that. But they found an ear with the leadership, and we went out and met with them and tried to figure out something that would make them happy and still give us essentially a trophy fishery for muskie on the French Broad. So what we agreed on went into effect 2 years later on July 1st of '07, and that was to have a 46-inch one fish reg for the French Broad main channel only from US 64 up to Wilson Road Bridge. And then the rest of the river and all other North Carolina waters would continue to be managed under the more liberal regulation. And that stayed in effect for about 3 years. And I guess it was around 2010, the club expressed some interest in a more protective regulation for Lake Adger, which I think was proposed as 40 inches. And when that went to Raleigh, the Raleigh office called me and they expressed interest in having one regulation that covered all muskie fisheries in the state. And I said we could do that, but it would need to be a lot better than what the statewide was at the time. So what we decided on was the 42-1 that exists now. And the reason I settled on that specific regulation was because the new river was being managed by Virginia with that regulation, and we felt like because the new river wound in and out of North Carolina and Virginia a couple of times, that would simplify that situation a lot, and it was a much more protective regulation, even though it was backing off a little bit of the 46-1 for that one stretch of the French Broad. It was putting all the waters of the state under a more protective regulation. So after discussion, the Muskie Club concurred with that and went to public hearing with the Muskie Club support and passed, and that went into effect July 1st of 2010 and exists to this day. So that's the story on the regulations. Here's another little sidebar which I thought was pretty cool. I found this cleaning out my basement a couple of months ago. It's reported on the state record in South Carolina, and that was an unintended side effect of our management of Lake Adger. Is that we had washdowns into the Broad River, and they went into South Carolina, and for the first time probably in recorded history, people in South Carolina were catching muskie. And the first one was found by a power company on one of their trash racks on a dam 100 miles downstream of Adger, and it was they say it was a 25-pound 10-ounce fish with a 3-pound carp lodged in its mouth, and they found it on the trash rack in 1984. And then this report of a state record is from 20 years later in 2004. But for a good amount of time, people were picking up muskie in the Broad in those first few dozen miles below the state line as a result of fish going downstream from Lake Adger. So that was not anything we intended to happen, but another fishery that existed. All right. Another thing that was a big change after the turn of the century, I guess probably in the early 2000s, was, and the hatchery guys really can talk about this a lot more than I can, but it was a big thing, and that was the change in the way we were growing muskie. Because back in the day, we were just putting the putting the fry in the ponds up there at Table Rock. And they would go in beginning of the summer, and you know, all you really had until we drew the ponds down in October was whatever visual guess you can make by walking around the pond to see if you saw any fingerlings in there. And what we get sometimes these are from the same year, one year back in the 90s, I think, from the ponds. And the bottom fish, you might get 90 of those out of a pond, or 150, or you might get 1,000 like that little guy on top. Or you might get nothing. And we never really knew until drawdown what would happen. I say we, it really wasn't, you know, I worried about it, but Gene Wilson at the hatchery really worried about it, because it was on him, and it was kind of a nail-biting way to manage for growing muskie. But it was what we had then. But now, and for the last few years, you know, we've got a much better system with the indoor raceways, and being able to cull and grade the fish and manage for specific sizes, specific numbers, and knowing as you're going along how the fish are doing. And you can, it's really improved the predictability of our musky fingerling production. Another thing I wanted to touch on was we made an effort in the I guess probably maybe 10, 12 years ago to look at the possibility of additional waters for musky fisheries, and I put it to the district to suggest a couple of places to try, and what we came up with was Lake Emery and the upper Little Tennessee River in over in Franklin. That's a picture of Emery there, and then the more riverine section upstream. But you can see there's a lot of structure, but you know, it's clear, it's got a big sediment load too. So we've never been able to figure out a good fishery to put in there, and so we thought we'd try with the muskie. And then the other place was Cheover Reservoir down below Fontana, which is a beautiful lake, very secluded, cold lake full of trout. It's a stocked trout lake, and that was where that picture from 1950, the woman who caught that muskie. So that we knew there had been muskie there, so we decided to try those two systems and see if we could establish a muskie fishery in each of them. And the tools that we had that we didn't have before were two things that helped us here. One is triploidy, which is to manipulate the chromosomes in the fish so that they're theoretically unable to reproduce. So you can put triploid fish in a system as an experiment, and if the experiment doesn't work out the way you want it to, you can just stop stocking, and in a few years they'll die out, and you're back where you started, hopefully. That was a tool. It'd been around for a while, but it had not really been done much with muskie, and we started developing the triploid muskies. All through this I'm saying we, like I'm still part of this, but I can't help it. But the other thing is pit tagging, which is not a new technology, but it was new to us with muskie, and that's what Pete Lamb is doing there beside me with the little implanter. You see the old coated wire tagging in the background over there. But the pit tags are handy because they're just like a chip in your pet. You can and some of you are familiar with that because we're using them now. But they allow you to run the reader over a fish and not only know the fish is from the hatchery, but know exactly which fish it is, the date it was stocked, the location it was stocked, the size at which it was stocked. So you get a lot of information off of one number if you can get your hands on the fish. So that was the technique that we used for those experimental waters. The downside is that we didn't really create any fisheries over there. The Emory project, those fish just disappeared. We put them in there for 3 years at least, and we never saw any of those fish again. And we looked everywhere. We looked up and down the lake with several different kinds of gear. We shocked for them, we netted for them, we looked up the river for them, we looked down the river for them, we looked in the Little Tennessee arm of Fontana for them, and never found any of them. Now on Yow, we did see some survival and growth of those fish. We collected some with our gear over there, and they seemed to grow pretty well and everything. And if an angler was determined, like Glenn is, you could go over there and catch one.
Good job, Glenn.
Yeah. And that, I believe that's at the mouth of 20 Mile Creek. So he's probably, unless I'm wrong, he's about within 100 yards of where that woman caught that one in 1950. So at least we went full circle there. But Yow was a trout fishery primarily, and it, we never really saw a tremendous amount of interest in people going that far over there to fish for muskie, given the catch rates that they could expect when they had more reliable waters, right here at home. So I'm not sure exactly where that one stands. Powell was leading that, and it was still ongoing when I retired. So I'll just kind of leave the door open on that one. But I think Yow is really better as a trout lake, and that seemed to be where we were leaning at the time. Another big thing that happened in the 2000s was river access. Like this one, there's a backward picture of Penrose when we were building that. And then there's the new ramp at Westbelt that actually goes to the river. So, that was the beginning of increases in access. We had some, for a number of years, for a variety of arcane reasons, there was not much interest in improved access for rivers in western North Carolina, but that changed in the mid-2000s, and as funding and cooperative relationships came along, as you know now, we've got a good number of ramps up and down the river, whereas a few years ago we just had a few meager concrete slabs and a slide at Blantyre. One other thing that we did right before I retired was we got NCSU and Dylan Owensby to actually do some radio tracking in Musky. There's Dylan with the antenna looking for a reed. And here's a picture of a muskie, and you can kind of see trailing off the tail of that muskie, you can see a little wire. And that's the transmitter antenna that actually, the transmitter itself is surgically implanted in the body cavity of the fish, but the antenna comes through a little syringe hole in the side of the fish and trails behind it. And by using that tracking technique, we could see where those fish went in the first 3 to 4 months, and if we were lucky, 5 or 6 months after they were stocked. And that gave us a little bit of a handle on two things. One is, are the fish staying where we put them, and are they surviving to even through the first part of the first year. And we ran that one year up in the New River where we used to stock muskie in the North Carolina section, and discovered that neither one was happening. Most of them were not surviving, and the few that were we're moving a good distance downstream, typically to Virginia, where there's already a really nice musky fishery without, our help or interference. So we ultimately decided to manage the North Carolina section for smallmouth and let the musky fishery be in the Virginia section. The second year, we moved Dylan down to the French Broad and we did the same thing on the French Broad and found the opposite, that the fish had a good survival rate, stayed in the areas we were managing for musky, and as we might have suspected by the fact that we always had musky with hatchery tags in them, but it was good to know that the fish weren't washing away and weren't getting wiped out in super high numbers. So that gave us a lot more encouragement that our stocking program was working, and led to the idea, well, if they're sticking around, maybe there's a possibility of restoring some habitat in the river and maybe enhancing natural reproduction, and that leads us right up to the here and now, and the picture that was posted yesterday of the new habitat work that's going on up there at the mouth of Mud Creek. So that kind of gets me up to the present day as far as the management history. But the other big thing that we did with the between me and the club was the fishing events, and especially the Powhatan Fish Day. Again, everything's in reverse, but here's a picture from about 2007. I think that was the year we had 317 kids. But I don't know. I'll hold that up again. Just look at the pier. Look how many little heads are out there on the pier. That was a big event, and it was hot. But anyway, we'd have good years, and you get a lot of really cool moments. These kids with Smokey there having a good day, and then these kids having a good day, and then these youngins. Remember, that seems like a long time ago. But you make a lot of good friends, have a good time. It's a good thing to do. And the kids occasionally get to catch fish. But even if they don't, they get prizes. They get hamburgers and hot dogs, and it's all kinds of fun for everybody. So we've done that for Lori could probably tell you how many years, more than I can remember. They were doing it when I came, and when we get through this mess, we'll do it again. In addition to that, we've got an event over in the Chewa district for the special needs adults on the little pond they've got over there behind the work center. And that's a lot of fun too. It only takes about 3 or 4 club members, because they have caregivers that come with the people. And but those folks have a good time, and everybody catches fish, because it's a little bathtub full of brook trout, and everybody catches fish every year, and it's a lot of fun. So that's another thing I look forward to seeing start up again someday. Now, one thing we used to do that we don't do anymore was called Jake's Day, which was over in the Biltmore Estate. I think it was a multi-resource event sponsored by the Wild Turkey Federation and some other sporting groups that the Muskie Club was involved in. And we had a site. They had sites that the kids would rotate among. And we had the fishing site down at the pond over in the vineyards. And the kids would come over there, and they'd get like 30 minutes, and we'd try to get them. The pond wasn't stocked or anything, but we'd at least get them pitching some bait out into the pond. And here's another picture of it. And the reason I'm holding that one up is that man in the middle is Carl King. And some of you know Carl, but Carl is the man who came up with the idea for the Veterans Fish Day. And when Carl suggested it, we kind of started planning it out, and what we came up with was what essentially we're doing today is to have the guys from the VA, and then we added the Veterans Restoration Quarters guys to come out and have a day, on the lake, and get outside and just enjoy life, and have a hamburger and hopefully catch a fish. And unfortunately, when we started, we were doing it at Powhatan on Veterans Day, so that's one of those early ones, and we gave it a good effort. We got the VA guys out there, and got the Forest Service set up with the food and everything, and the condiments, and then the man himself out there grilling the meat. So we had it all going on, except catching fish was a little problematic. We've got a few. Here's one. There's a nice one there. But after a couple years, Powhatan on Veterans Day wasn't really panning out as a really successful fishing event. But fortunately, about that same time, Dave Deaton got the outreach pond set up really nice at Marion, and now we can bring those guys down to a nice shelter with facilities on site to cook and bathrooms, and a well-stocked pond where you can pull out monster bluegill and monster catfish all morning, and then have a hamburger lunch, and that's turned into a wonderful event. I really missed it last year, and I don't know what's going to happen this year, but we'll go back to that when we can, because that's just a really nice thing. And there's Don with one of the fishermen. You can kind of see the layout there in the back, although it's in reverse. You can kind of see what we've got going on there. So that takes me to retirement. That's me with the Forest Service colleagues that I worked with over the years, and that's the thing that you really walk away from all this, because most of the actual scientific studies and stuff, after 10 years, nobody, they cite them in the back of their papers, but nobody really gets excited about stuff that happened 10, 20 years ago, except as a matter of the fossil record. But the thing that lasts is the relationships with the colleagues and the friendships you make over the course of things. So here's a picture of me with all the old retired fish guys, and just joined that group there at the end of 2016, and that was the end of my career. But it was not the end of my relationship with the Muskie Club, because you guys, formed relationships with you guys too. So that's something that's been ongoing. So I wanted to show this picture is significant because this was my last haircut. This is when Don was very appropriately awarded his wildlife exceptional volunteer. I can't get the title right. Don's got the trophy. He can read it to you sometime. But he got the big award from the Big Poobahs, and it was a good time and well deserved. And we continue to do the fish days and then other volunteer projects. This is us staining the new pier out at Powhatan. But I think that takes me to the end of my pictures. I'm going to see, I think I got a couple other things over here.
There's been a couple questions. I can only see 3 comments at one time. So as soon as David's done, if you've asked a question during this, let's do them, but try to watch the feed and do them one at a time. All right, thank you.
Well, y'all know Tim, and you know all the efforts that Tim makes for keeping the club going. But Tim's the third in the line of succession. Well, actually fourth, because
There's actually quite a few more.
yeah, but just want to show these two guys just because I got things to say. And there's our fearless leader out on the Lake Adger in the wintertime somewhere. But Don ran the club since like the beginning of time up until, I don't know, about 15 years ago, and then Glenn stepped up. And there's the picture of the club when I'm not sure, that might be when we were still at Quincy's. But the thing I remember about Glenn's time with the club was, I think up to that point, I would come to speak and, also to listen. But Glenn, in addition, and I'm going to embarrass him if he's watching, but in addition to being just an outstanding fisherman, he's an outstanding teacher. And I learned a lot in those years. We started doing doing workshops more and going fishing, and stuff. We'd been really heavily involved for years with public service and stuff like that, but that was really when we really started trying to get more people in and entice people to come to the club to talk fishing and learn about fishing, and that's what I always think of when I think of Glenn. Is he'll gladly share anything he's learned about his fishing with you, and we've had a lot of discussions, and we can disagree and still have a gentlemanly discussion, and we seldom do disagree. But anyway, knowing Glenn's given me hope for the rest of us. So on that note, I'll stop and take questions.
All right, he's taking questions. I believe Chris Kane asked earlier if South Carolina was upset about Muskies getting into their waters.
I don't know if they were really upset. They had no intention of, really having a musky fishery, but it wasn't, we never had any serious environmental concerns over it. We didn't intend for the fish to go downstream. Obviously when you stock particular waters, you want them to stay where you put them, but it was never a major issue. I think, had they raised a major concern, we would have dealt with it in some way. I guess short answer is I don't think they were tremendously concerned. It was just sort of a curiosity.
Free stocking of muskies.
Yeah.
Who's going to complain?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Glenn asked, what accomplishment is your favorite?
Oh man, surviving the 30 years probably, and the relationships are the biggest reward out of everything. Everything else you do in a career can be undone. You can develop standardized methods that the younger guys decide are bogus and go with something else. You can make conclusions about the science that are later refuted. You can build piers that a tree comes along and knocks down. But it's the relationships. We've watched each other's kids grow up. We've grown old together, and that's what you take away.
Okay. Will said, good stuff, David. Can you tell us some about blueback herring?
Oh, yeah, a shad question. Yeah, blueback. that was a game changer. When I first came up here, like I was saying, I was trying to sustain forage bases in some of the mountain reservoirs by stocking threadfin shad. And about 3 years into that, we started seeing, from a variety of sources, we were seeing river herring, which is blueback herring and alewife. They're both native to our coastal rivers, very important fisheries down there. Though when they become landlocked, they tend to alter the food webs of the reservoirs in a lot of different ways. They can feed on a wide variety of different types of plankton, so they can compete with other shad. They can compete with game fish. They can eat fish eggs. They can eat larval fish. And there was some indication that a diet high in blueback herring will actually alter the nutritional environment within which the female game fish were developing eggs, and maybe affect fertility of game fish like walleye or white bass. But regardless of the mechanisms involved, with the thing we observed was when blueback herring got into these systems that walleye reproduction and white bass reproduction tanked, basically. I went from spending the first 5 years of my career telling people why we weren't going to stock walleye in their reservoirs to telling them how soon I was going to stock walleye in their reservoirs. And trying to explain why that didn't make me a liar the first time, but it changed everything. And for the fish species the game fish species that continue to occur in the reservoirs, some of them have responded well to the new forage base. The thing that happened early on, I remember, especially with walleye, is it changes the patterns. And as they've gotten into adger, that may be part of what's going on down there. Is fish that used to be up in the shallows chasing prey from is falling in off the shoreline, or bluegill or whatever in the shallows, suddenly are nowhere to be seen because they're down deep chasing the blueback. And that caused some consternation for people for a long time, but it's also really cool for the guys that figured it out, and figured out how to catch them where they were now. And it's not a black and white thing. Sometimes they're mostly bad for a reservoir. Sometimes they provide new opportunities, but they certainly changed the entire playing field for us. And we went from I think when I first came up here and was down, talking down the virtues of stocking, I think the Table Rock guys were worried I was going to put them out of a job. But before long, they were worried about where they were going to get all the fish. So.
Mike Trofmuck asked, what do you know about the muskie population below MSD down at the Tennessee line?
Not a great deal. We've in cooperation with I hate calling them non-game because that was kind of a game fish bias thing. I can't remember what you guys call yourself now. I'm going to say aquatic biodiversity. Maybe that's still Luke and those guys. We're doing some sampling down there, and we tried to piggyback on that and pick up a fish here and there, but mainly we'd see the ones that they caught in the course of doing their surveys, and then other fish that anglers catch. We've never done any systematic surveys down that way. There's not many places other than right at Hot Springs where we can get a boat on the river, and about the only other way we could do that is, I guess maybe a creel survey or angler diaries, which we're doing now at the club. So our best chance, and I'm still saying we, but I guess if I were still a biologist, I would say my best chance of learning about those fisheries would be if you guys caught fish down there and recording them in your diaries. That's probably the best information we've got, because it's just a tough section to put any kind of survey vessel on, and it's too spread out to really do a creel survey. It's just a hard place to quantify. So, short answer is we don't know much. We've seen some big fish come out of there, but as far as numbers or anything else, that's about all I know.
Anything else for David about David? Guys, I appreciate everybody watching. I know there's quite a handful of you that, man, this conversation has made me want to say so many things, and it's not like I can sit here and take notes in the rain and everything. Let's see, Terry Barrett's got one last question. He says, what is your vision for the future of the muskie in North Carolina as an interest in muskie fishing expands across the country? Do you believe that the state will follow this trend and try to expand the number? He's going to make me hit the C more and screw up my video. Number of quality fisheries in the state.
Yeah, I think we're in North Carolina. I think we're pretty much up against a wall as far as available fisheries. There are places that you could set up muskie fisheries, but you'd have to do it at the expense of fisheries that are already there, I guess, and because there's a lot of other reservoirs, and you could pick any one of them and stock muskie in it, but they're already being managed for walleye or stripers or black bass, and as far as, I don't think there's anything undiscovered. There's a few river reaches that we don't stock that might support a small muskie fishery, but after the experience on the Little Tennessee, I feel like they stocked about everywhere back in the 70s, and in some places it took hold, and others it didn't. And I think really the French Broad and maybe the Upper Catawba are the systems that I'd hang my hat on, and I'm sure there's opportunities to enhance those in various ways. Obviously, we're trying to improve the French Broad's ability to naturally generate fingerlings, which would be awesome. And there's opportunities over in the Catawba too, I'm sure. But I was really adamant as I got to the end of my career about letting the guys that came after me have the same chance I did, which was to pretty much take a clean slate and come up with some ideas and do, try to discover things. So I guess I'll leave it to them. But I feel like addressing the issue of quality, that I've seen, there's some increased size limits in other states and other waters that I've seen recently. And the thing about going to a bigger size limit implies two things. One is that people taking the fish is the problem, and the other is that when you let a fish go that's an inch smaller than that size limit, it's going to survive. And we're down here at the ragged edge of the thermal range of those fish, so for a good part of the year, that's a tall order. There's times and conditions where if we had a 48-inch limit and you catch a 47-inch muskie in the French Broad in August, I don't know if letting that fish go is ever going to produce a 48-inch fish. If you're really good and you're really careful and that fish is really lucky, maybe. But I think a general ethic of catch and release is good, but there's just a limit to what. There's a limit to limits, I guess, is what I'm saying. You've got to have fast-growing fish. You've got to have a lot of harvest pressure, and you've got to have good survival on the released fish for for a harvest limit to work. Kind of going off on a tangent, but that's my philosophy on that.
All right, we're going to close it up.
Thank you guys. I appreciate everything you guys do and all the kind words when we thought we were going to do this last week. Hope I didn't disappoint. And we'll see you at the next meeting.
I don't think it disappointed everything. If there's something that, I mean, as he spoke, there's about 20 things that I really wanted to say at the end, and I'm like, well, I'm not, I should have brought pencil and paper out here to a wet, windy, nasty party so I could write things down I wanted to say, but that, long story short, is that David has a long time with the club, and the effects of what he's done is very evident, and the effort that he put into not just his entire life's work into this, but just this meeting tonight is a lot for something that he never had to do as a biologist. And I don't think that we can thank him enough for that. So anybody that, this video is going to be saved. People that watched it tonight, I appreciate you being here for you to watch it live, and for people that watch this thing in the future, send them a note and say, thank you, because it's the involvement with the club, all the original members and members that joined all through the 80s and 90s while I was a child, watching their relationship with the Resource Commission and with David and the way that they did things is kind of what made me kind of have to step up and realize that this is worth preserving, and it's very important to document this history, because as we keep including new members, which we've done a lot during COVID, a lot of these new people have no idea who people like David Yow, and I don't know how they missed Donald Funderud, but sometimes they have no idea who these people are. And their pink hula hoops and crazy stories and all the stuff that club members laugh about, but people of the page have really no idea about. And what David said about the camaraderie and getting to go to the meetings with these people, and then seeing them on the water and watching them become successful catching these fish, and then going on days like what David brought up about kids fishing day, vets fishing day, and the assisted adults living fishing day. Those, you go do those and you participate in them. You don't feel like you're doing a whole lot, but you're there. And to be there and to help out in those things is a whole lot. So everybody, David Yow is not a big social media user, but send him a message and thank him for what he's put into this community and this fishery and this club. I don't think I can end with a better statement than that. We'll tell y'all good night. Later.
Thank you, Tim.